The fire burned for 3 days. Not in one city, in all of them. From the eastern shores of the Mediterranean to the highlands of Anatolia. From the palaces of Greece to the fortified towns of Syria. Smoke rose into an autumn sky. The year was approximately 1200 BC. The world as it had existed for 5 centuries was ending. No one alive understood what was happening. A merchant in Ugarit watched flames consume the warehouse where his family had stored grain for 4 generations. A scribe in Pylos fled his palace as bronze-tipped spears shattered the door. A farmer in Hattusa returned from the fields to find his village abandoned, the granaries empty, the roads filled with refugees heading nowhere. They did not know they were living through a collapse. They thought it was a war, a drought, a temporary crisis. They were wrong. Within a single generation, nearly every major civilization in the eastern Mediterranean would fall. Cities that had stood for centuries would burn and never be rebuilt. Trade routes that connected 3 continents would go silent. Writing systems would be forgotten. Technologies would vanish. The population of the region would drop by 60 to 70%. This was not a single catastrophe. It was a cascade. A systems failure so complete that historians still struggle to explain it 3,000 years later. This is the story of the Bronze Age collapse. Not the story of kings or gods or mythical warriors. The story of how complex societies fail, how interconnected systems unravel, how the world people trusted could simply stop working, and how those who survived had to build something new from the ruins. Because the world did not end in 1200 BC, it just became unrecognizable. For nearly 500 years, the late Bronze Age Mediterranean had been the most interconnected world humanity had ever created. From roughly 1600 to 1200 BC, a web of kingdoms, city-states, and empires stretched across 3 continents, bound together by trade, diplomacy, and mutual dependence. This was not a unified empire. It was something more fragile and more sophisticated, a system of interconnected economies that relied on each other to function. At the center of this world were 4 great powers. Egypt controlled the Nile Valley and extended its influence into Canaan and Syria. The Hittite Empire dominated Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, from its capital at Hattusa. The Mycenaean Greeks ruled the Aegean from fortified palace cities like Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos. And the Kassites controlled Babylon and southern Mesopotamia. Around these powers orbited dozens of smaller kingdoms, the coastal cities of Canaan, the merchant republics of Ugarit and Byblos, the Mitanni in northern Syria, the Cypriots who controlled the copper trade, and countless others. They were linked by trade routes that had taken centuries to establish. Tin from Afghanistan traveled westward through Mesopotamia to reach bronze workers in Greece. Copper from Cyprus moved in every direction, the lifeblood of an age defined by bronze tools and weapons. Egyptian grain fed populations across the eastern Mediterranean. Timber from Lebanon built ships and palaces from Egypt to Anatolia. Luxury goods, glass, ivory, purple dye, perfumes, jewelry, moved along routes both maritime and overland, creating networks of merchants who spoke multiple languages and maintained relationships across vast distances. The palace economies that dominated this world were extraordinarily complex. Scribes in Linear B recorded every jar of oil, every bushel of grain, every sheep in the royal flocks. Bureaucrats managed vast redistribution systems, collecting taxes in kind and dispensing rations to workers. Specialized craftsmen, potters, metalworkers, textile workers, shipbuilders produced goods for both local use and export. The palaces didn't just rule, they organized economic life on a scale that would not be seen again for 1,000 years. Diplomacy bound these kingdoms together almost as tightly as trade. Royal archives preserved letters between kings who addressed each other as brother and exchanged gifts of gold, horses, and daughters in marriage. The Amarna letters from Egypt reveal a world of constant negotiation, where minor disputes over trade agreements or bride prices required careful management, where kingdoms formed alliances and counter-alliances, where power was balanced through marriage, tribute, and mutual recognition. This was not peace, but it was stable. For the people who lived in this world, life revolved around the palace and the temple. In Mycenaean Greece, palace centers controlled the surrounding countryside through a system of local administrators. Farmers owed labor and produce to the palace. In return, they received protection, access to communal resources, and participation in religious festivals. In the Hittite Empire, loyalty to the king was personal and sacred, bound by oaths sworn before the gods. Trade cities like Ugarit functioned as cosmopolitan hubs where Akkadian served as the international language of commerce, where merchants from a dozen cultures lived in designated quarters, where temples to foreign gods stood alongside local shrines. The physical infrastructure of this world was impressive. Massive stone walls surrounded the Mycenaean citadels, walls so large that later Greeks would believe they were built by giants. The Hittite capital at Hattusa sprawled across hundreds of acres, protected by fortifications with elaborate gate complexes. Egyptian temples rose along the Nile, monuments to divine kingship and state power. Ships capable of carrying tons of cargo plied the Mediterranean, following seasonal winds and established routes marked by coastal landmarks. But this world had a hidden fragility. It was too interconnected. The palace economies depended on continuous flows of raw materials from distant sources. A disruption in Cyprus meant bronze workers in Greece had no copper. A drought in one region meant famine could spread. The specialized labor forces required constant management and feeding. The diplomatic system required stability. A collapse in one kingdom could destabilize its neighbors. Everything depended on everything else. And when the system began to fail, there was no way to isolate the damage. By 1225 BC, the first cracks were appearing, but no one yet understood what they meant. Life in the Bronze Age world moved to rhythms that had remained unchanged for generations. In the Mycenaean palace of Pylos, scribes arrived each morning to clay tablets that would never be fired, never meant to be permanent. They recorded the day's business in linear B, sheep counted, bronze allocated to smiths, women assigned to grind grain, rowers summoned for the fleet. The tablets were temporary records, meant to be recycled at year's end when accounts were settled. They survived only because the palace burned with them still wet. A typical Mycenaean farmer lived in a small stone house in a village 5 or 6 miles from the palace center. He woke before dawn, walked to fields his family had worked for generations, and cultivated barley, wheat, and legumes on land technically owned by the palace but worked as his own. His taxes were paid in kind, a portion of the harvest, a certain number of days of labor on palace construction projects, sons who might be called for military service or rowing duty. In return, the palace provided protection, administered justice, organized religious festivals, and maintained granaries for times of shortage. His wife worked wool, not as a hobby, but as a centralized industrial operation. The palace archives record hundreds of women in textile workshops, processing wool from the vast royal flocks, spinning thread, and weaving cloth that would be traded across the Mediterranean. Some of these women were slaves, captured in raids or born into servitude. Others were free but poor, working for rations. The palace at Pylos alone employed over 500 textile workers, their production carefully monitored by scribes who recorded every stage of the process. In the coastal city of Ugarit, life had a different rhythm. This was a merchant republic, wealthy from trade, cosmopolitan in a way the palace economies could never be. Ships arrived from Cyprus carrying copper ingots, from Egypt with grain and papyrus, from the Aegean with pottery and olive oil. The harbor master collected customs duties. Foreign merchants maintained warehouses in designated quarters. Scribes fluent in Akkadian, the language of international trade, drafted contracts and maintained commercial archives. Hittite merchants had invented their own alphabetic script, simpler than the complex cuneiform used by the great powers, perfectly suited for keeping accounts and recording transactions. A merchant's son in Ugarit might spend his youth learning languages, studying trade routes, making contacts in foreign ports. By his 20s, he would be traveling regularly, carrying letters of credit, negotiating prices for shipments of timber or purple dye, maintaining relationships built over generations. His world was sophisticated and interconnected in ways that would not be seen again until the Hellenistic period 1,000 years later. But by 1225 BC, that world was changing in ways that seemed small at first. Ships that should have arrived from Cyprus were delayed or simply never came. Prices for copper began to rise. Egyptian records mention increased activity along their borders, groups the scribes simply called foreigners or northerners, people who didn't fit into the established categories of known kingdoms and peoples. Hittite letters speak of grain shortages, requests for emergency shipments, concerns about feeding the population. The climate was shifting. Paleoclimate data shows that the eastern Mediterranean was entering a period of severe drought, the driest conditions in centuries. Harvests failed. Springs that had flowed for generations went dry. Pastoralists who depended on seasonal grazing found their ranges shrinking. People began to move, slowly at first, searching for better conditions. This was not yet a crisis, just stress, just uncertainty. The palace economies tried to respond the way they always had, through careful management and redistribution. Hittite kings sent grain to vassal cities suffering from famine. Egyptian pharaohs organized shipments to Syria. Palace granaries released stored supplies. But the drought persisted year after year, and the reserves began to run low. The careful balance that had sustained the system for centuries was breaking down. In the Aegean, the Mycenaean palaces were fortifying, not in response to any specific threat, but from a general sense of insecurity. At Mycenae, workers extended the massive walls to enclose new areas within the citadel. At Tiryns, they constructed elaborate underground passages to ensure access to water during a siege. At Athens, they built a massive covered stairway down to a spring. These were expensive projects, requiring enormous amounts of labor and resources. They suggest kingdoms preparing for something, even if they didn't know what. Pirates became more bold. Raids that had once been occasional annoyances became regular threats. Coastal settlements built walls or were abandoned. Trade routes became dangerous. Ships traveled in convoys or avoided certain waters entirely. The Hittite king wrote to the king of Ugarit, demanding he send ships to help protect the coast, suggesting that even great powers were struggling to maintain security. And then there were the Sea Peoples. Egyptian records mention them first, groups with names that would echo through history: Peliset, Cheker, Shekelesh, Denyen, Weshesh. They were not a unified army. They were migrants, raiders, refugees, displaced peoples moving by land and sea, sometimes attacking, sometimes simply trying to survive. The Egyptians called them invaders. The reality was more complex. They were both causes and symptoms of a world coming apart. For the farmer in his field, the textile worker at her loom, the merchant checking his warehouse inventory, these were troubling times, but not yet catastrophic. Life continued, the routines held, the palaces still functioned, the trade ships still sailed, if less frequently. There was anxiety, certainly, uncertainty, but civilization had weathered difficulties before. This would pass. It would not pass. The collapse did not announce itself. There was no single moment when the Bronze Age world ended. Instead, there was a cascade of failures, each one making the next more likely, each one harder to recover from, until the entire system simply stopped functioning. Around 1200 BC, the Hittite Empire fell. The capital at Hattusa was abandoned, its massive fortifications left empty, its palaces burned or simply deserted. The exact sequence of events remains unclear because the Hittites stopped writing. The archives end abruptly, mid-sentence in some cases, clay tablets left unfired as scribes fled or died. The last letters from the Hittite king speak of grain shortages, of enemy ships spotted off the coast, of troops being sent to defend the western territories, and then silence. Hattusa was not sacked in a single dramatic assault. Archaeological evidence suggests the city was gradually abandoned, its population dispersing over months or even years. Some sections show signs of fire, but not total destruction. It looks less like conquest and more like administrative collapse, a government that simply ceased to function, and a population that realized there was no reason to stay. The carefully managed palace economy that had fed thousands, organized labor, maintained infrastructure, collected taxes, and administered justice had broken down. Without it, there was no point to the city. The fall of the Hittite Empire sent shockwaves through the system. Vassal states in Syria that had depended on Hittite protection suddenly found themselves exposed. Trade routes through Anatolia, routes that had carried tin and other essential materials westward for centuries, were disrupted. Refugees from Hittite territories moved south and west, adding pressure to regions already stressed by drought and food shortages. The balance of power that had maintained stability for generations was broken. Within a few years, the coastal cities of Syria began to fall. Ugarit, the wealthy merchant republic that had thrived for centuries, was destroyed around 1190 BC. The evidence of its end is remarkably preserved because the destruction was so complete and so sudden. A layer of ash covers the final occupation level. Tablets baked hard by the fires preserve the last moments of the city's life. One letter, never sent, speaks of enemy ships approaching the coast. Another mentions that the city's own fleet has been sent away, leaving the harbor defenseless. A third describes the army being ambushed in the mountains, too far away to return in time. The collapse of these administrative centers meant more than the loss of elite culture. It meant the end of the entire economic system they supported. When the palace at Pylos burned, it wasn't just a building that was lost. It was the entire redistributive economy that fed thousands, organized specialized labor, maintained infrastructure, and coordinated regional production. The textile workers lost their employment. The bronzesmiths lost their supply of raw materials. The farmers lost their markets and protection. The scribes lost their purpose entirely, and with them went literacy in Linear B. Egypt survived, but barely. Pharaoh Ramesses III faced multiple invasions in the early 12th century BC, waves of attackers coming by land and sea. His mortuary temple at Medinet Habu preserves detailed reliefs of the battles, showing Egyptian forces fighting enemies who traveled with ox carts full of families, who brought women and children, who were clearly not just raiders, but entire populations on the move. The reliefs show ships burning, prisoners being taken, bodies piling up on battlefields. Egypt won these battles, but the cost was enormous. The inscriptions at Medinet Habu describe the scope of the catastrophe. The foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands. All at once, the lands were removed and scattered in the fray. No land could stand before their arms. Hatti, Kode, Carchemish, Arzawa, and Alasia were cut off at one time. This was Egypt's perspective on watching the entire Bronze Age world collapse around them. Their victory was Pyrrhic. Egypt would never again wield the same power or influence. The new kingdom was effectively over. Food systems failed. The droughts continued year after year. The palace economies that had managed agricultural surplus and distribution were gone. Local famines became regional catastrophes. Populations declined through starvation, disease, and migration. Areas that had supported dense populations were abandoned as people moved toward any region that seemed more stable, which only spread the crisis further. The social fabric disintegrated. Without the palaces to enforce order, provide justice, or maintain infrastructure, communities had to rely on themselves. But communities built around specialized labor and trade couldn't function in isolation. The bronzesmith needed tin he could no longer get. The farmer needed protection that no longer existed. The merchant had no markets to trade with. The carefully constructed interdependence that had been the Bronze Age world's greatest strength became its fatal vulnerability. Literacy disappeared in most regions. When the palaces fell, the scribes who maintained writing systems lost their employment and their purpose. Linear B was forgotten so completely that it would not be deciphered until the 1950s. The Luwian hieroglyphic script of Anatolia vanished. Only in a few places, like Egypt and a handful of Phoenician cities, did writing survive the collapse. For most of the Eastern Mediterranean, the world went dark. We call the next 3 centuries the Greek Dark Ages, not because they were uniquely terrible, but because we have almost no written records. People stopped writing, or forgot how, or had no need for it anymore. By 1150 BC, the world that had existed for 5 centuries was gone. The world that emerged from the collapse was fundamentally different. For 3 centuries, from roughly 1150 to 800 BC, the Eastern Mediterranean existed in what historians call a dark age. Not because life was necessarily worse for everyone, but because the complexity that had defined the Bronze Age world had vanished. The palaces were gone, the bureaucracies were gone, the trade networks were gone. And with them went the written records that let us understand what people's lives were like. Population levels dropped dramatically. Archaeological surveys show a collapse in the number of occupied sites across Greece, Anatolia, and the Levant. Some estimates suggest the population of Greece fell by 75% or more. Entire regions were depopulated. The survivors clustered in smaller communities, often in more defensible locations, sometimes reverting to subsistence agriculture in areas that had once supported complex economies. Cities that had held thousands now held hundreds or were abandoned entirely. The loss of literacy was perhaps the most striking change. In Greece, Linear B disappeared completely, and with it went all record-keeping, all administrative writing, all ability to preserve information across generations in written form. The Mycenaean Greeks had been literate for centuries. Their descendants would not read or write again until they borrowed and adapted the Phoenician alphabet around 800 BC, 500 years after the collapse. An entire civilization forgot how to write. The knowledge of how to read Linear B was so thoroughly lost that modern scholars needed linear algebra and the work of genius to decode it. Technology regressed in measurable ways. The production of bronze declined sharply because the trade networks that had supplied tin no longer functioned. Iron began to replace bronze, not because iron technology was superior. At first, iron technology was actually inferior to good bronze, but because iron ore was locally available while the components of bronze were not. This was an adaptation born of necessity, not innovation. The quality of pottery declined, monumental architecture essentially stopped. The skills required for palace construction, for massive fortifications, for elaborate frescoes and sophisticated metalwork were either lost or no longer had patrons who could support them. But the collapse was not uniformly catastrophic. Some regions adapted and even prospered. The Phoenician cities of the Levantine coast, particularly Tyre and Sidon, survived and eventually thrived by expanding maritime trade into the power vacuum left by the collapse. They would go on to establish colonies across the Mediterranean, spreading their alphabetic writing system, which would become the ancestor of Greek, Latin, and eventually most modern alphabets. Their survival proved that smaller, more flexible political units could sometimes weather catastrophes that destroyed empires. Egypt survived but was fundamentally weakened. The New Kingdom ended. Egypt would never again dominate the Levant as it had during the Late Bronze Age. The country fragmented, reunified, fragmented again. Foreign dynasties would eventually rule Egypt. The age of the great pharaohs was over, though the civilization itself would continue for another 1,000 years, a shadow of its former glory. In Greece, the Dark Ages eventually gave way to the Archaic period and the rise of the city-states. The polis system that would define classical Greece was born from the ashes of the palace economies. Communities reorganized around different principles: citizen assemblies, shared governance, less centralized control. In some ways, the collapse cleared ground for new forms of social organization that would prove historically influential. But this transformation took centuries and came at an enormous cost. The psychological impact is harder to measure, but perhaps more profound. The Greeks of the Dark Ages preserved memories of the Mycenaean world in oral tradition, but transformed them into myth. The Linear B tablets show us the reality: careful bureaucrats counting sheep, managing textile workers, recording shipments of bronze. The later Greeks remembered these as the age of heroes, when demigods walked the earth, when Agamemnon led 1,000 ships to Troy, when Odysseus wandered for 10 years trying to return home. The reality had become so distant, so unrecognizable, that it could only be preserved as legend. People had to make sense of the ruins around them. Massive stone walls that their ancestors had built became the work of cyclops, of giants, because who else could have moved such stones? The sophisticated palace centers became the settings for myths of kings who dined with gods. The complex trade networks became heroic voyages. Memory itself had collapsed along with the civilization that created it, leaving only fragments, distorted by time and trauma, into something both true and false. The collapse taught a lesson that would echo through history. Complexity is fragile. Interconnection creates efficiency, but also vulnerability. Specialization produces wealth, but also dependence. The very things that had made the Bronze Age world successful, its trade networks, its palace economies, its interconnected diplomatic systems, had made it unable to survive systemic shocks. The survivors did not rebuild what had been lost. They could not. The knowledge, the resources, the social structures that had supported Bronze Age civilization were gone. Instead, they built something new, slowly, over generations, in ways that would have been unrecognizable to their ancestors. In the ruins of the Mycenaean world, small communities survived by returning to simpler forms of organization. Villages replaced palace centers. Local chiefs replaced bureaucratic administrators. Subsistence farming replaced managed agricultural systems. For people who had lived through the collapse, this was catastrophic regression. But for their children and grandchildren, it was simply life. They had no memory of palaces, no concept of the world their great-grandparents had known. The loss was invisible to them. The iron that replaced bronze changed more than just tools and weapons. It changed economics. Bronze required trade networks, specialist knowledge, centralized control of scarce resources. Iron ore was more common, found in many regions, workable by local smiths. Iron technology decentralized production. A village blacksmith could work iron without access to international trade. This made communities more self-sufficient, but also more isolated. the need for connection diminished, and with it, the motivation to rebuild the networks that had once spanned continents. The alphabet that emerged from Phoenician cities would prove more significant than any political power. Unlike the syllabic scripts of the Bronze Age, which required years of training and supported bureaucratic monopolies on literacy, the alphabet was simple enough that it could spread widely. When the Greeks adapted it around 800 BC, they created something revolutionary, a writing system accessible to ordinary citizens, not just professional scribes. This would eventually enable democracy, philosophy, and science in ways the palace economies never could have. The collapse had destroyed one form of civilization and accidentally created conditions for another.
Trade eventually returned, but on different terms. The merchant republics that emerged from Greek city-states, Phoenician colonies, eventually Carthage and others, operated without the palace control that had defined Bronze Age commerce. They were more entrepreneurial, more flexible, more willing to take risks. They established colonies not as imperial outposts, but as independent settlements connected by trade and culture. The Mediterranean world that developed after the Dark Ages was more diverse, less centralized, and in some ways more resilient than what had come before. But the human cost of this transformation was staggering. 3 centuries is 12 generations. 12 generations of reduced population, of harder lives, of knowledge lost, of communities struggling to survive. 12 generations of people who never knew the world could be different, who had no concept of the palaces their ancestors had built, the books they had written, the distances they had traveled. The survivors paid for transformation with forgetting. The myths that survived carried distorted memories. The Trojan War, probably a minor conflict or series of raids during the collapse period, became the defining story of Greek identity. The wanderings of Odysseus reflected the reality of disrupted trade routes, of familiar landmarks made strange, of homes that could no longer be reached. The descent into Hades mirrored the cultural descent into the Dark Ages. These stories were not history, but they preserved something true, the memory of loss, of a world that had ended, of the long struggle to find meaning in the aftermath. Some communities adapted by becoming more militarized. The Dorian Greeks, moving into the Peloponnese during or after the collapse, brought different social structures, different values. They emphasized warrior culture over bureaucracy, simplicity over complexity. Whether they were invaders or just survivors adapting to harsher conditions remains debated, but their influence reshaped Greek culture for centuries.
In the Levant, the power vacuum allowed new groups to establish themselves. The Philistines, possibly sea peoples who had settled rather than continuing to raid, established cities along the coast. The Israelites emerged in the highlands, their early settlements showing a mix of Canaanite and new influences. The ethnic and political map of the region was redrawn by populations moving, mixing, and establishing new identities in the ruins of the Old World. Egypt clung to continuity, but it was an increasingly hollow claim. The pharaohs still built temples, still claimed divine authority, still maintained the forms of the old religion. But the reality was diminishing power, foreign invasions, internal fragmentation. Egypt's survival was real, but so was its decline. The civilization that had helped define the Bronze Age would spend the next 2,000 years being conquered by Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, Arabs, watching its ancient glories become tourist attractions for successive waves of foreign rulers. The transformation was complete by 800 BC. The world that emerged bore almost no resemblance to what had been lost. New languages, new political systems, new technologies, new gods. The Bronze Age was not just ended, but forgotten. Its achievements reduced to legends, its cities reduced to mounds of earth that would not be excavated for 3,000 years. We live in an interconnected world, more interconnected than any that has existed before. Global supply chains move goods across continents in days. Digital networks transmit information instantly. Specialized economies depend on resources from distant sources. Complex systems manage food, water, energy, transportation, and communication. It all works seamlessly, most of the time, until it doesn't. The Bronze Age collapse offers no simple lessons. It was not caused by a single factor, but by a convergence of pressures: climate change, systems failure, migration, violence, economic breakdown. Each element fed the others. Each problem made the next one harder to solve. The very complexity that had created prosperity became the mechanism of collapse. We recognize the pattern now in ways the Bronze Age peoples could not. We have a historical perspective. We can see how interconnected systems create vulnerabilities, how specialization creates dependence, how long supply chains can break, how seemingly stable civilizations can unravel when multiple stresses converge. During the early months of the COVID-19 pandemic, supply chains stuttered. Ships sat in harbors, factories closed, store shelves emptied. It was temporary, contained, manageable, but it was recognizable. The sudden realization that the things we depend on come from far away, through complex systems we don't control, maintained by people we'll never meet. The fragility underneath the efficiency. The Bronze Age world took 500 years to build and 50 years to collapse. The people who lived through it had no framework to understand what was happening. They could not see the system. They could only see their own small piece of it failing. We can see the system. We study it, model it, worry about it. We know the risks of interconnection, of complexity, of dependence on distant resources and fragile networks. Whether that knowledge makes us less vulnerable or just more anxious is an open question. The Bronze Age ended. The world continued. People survived, adapted, built new civilizations from the ruins of the old. Not the same civilizations, not the same world, but something that worked, at least for a while. History doesn't repeat, but it shows us what's possible, what can be lost, how quickly complexity can unravel, how long recovery can take, and how the people living through collapse rarely understand what's happening until it's already over.